Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of the I Tried to Be Straight podcast with Susie.
And Nate.
And Nate is currently choking on some chips that he had before recording this episode.
I get hangry, so if I don't eat enough, it's bad, but also I eat too fast, which is bad, and I'm choking, and my eyes are watering, and I wasn't crying. I am just fighting for my life.
He literally was fighting for his life just a couple minutes ago.
So if you're wondering why my voice is extra raspy and sexy, honestly, it's because of the chips.
Cassava chips at your local Trader Joe's.
But thanks for listening.
Careful.
Thanks for listening to us in whatever condition we're in, even when we're dying. Yeah. Thank
Nate,
you.
I would love to ask you, what is one thing that made you know that you were gay?
Well, gosh, that's a big question. Being bad at sports was definitely a tell. Screaming a lot. I used to scream when I was like before I hit puberty, like loud. I could do like the loudest, most blood curdling scream ever. And also I really love to bake, and I can still bake some really good chocolate chip cookies. I've never made them for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you've really earned my love.
Wow.
There'll be cookies. That's
you heard it here first.
You heard it first.
Conditional love.
Conditional love. But speaking of conditional love,
No, that's not right. Speaking
my self-love.
How did you know you were gay?
Speaking of how did you know you were gay, we have a very great guest who had a pretty interesting journey figuring out he was gay. And his name is Timm with 2 M's. Double M Timm. And we would like to welcome to the podcast today, Timm with 2 M's.
Wow. Thank you, Nate and Susie. It's good to be here. Yeah, I have a superfluous M in my name. Long story, but had nothing to do with me being queer, but definitely happy to be here and definitely happy to talk today. So,
wow. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
We were hoping to get in a little bit of your story and then maybe ask some questions after that. Or, honestly, anything you want to talk about. If there's some other completely different direction, like we could talk about the weather, and that would also be fine, because it do be kind of cloudy out here right now.
It's a little overcast. It's been really rainy here. I'm in Baltimore, so it's really rainy here this week as well. But happy to talk about all sorts of things. It's been this has been a little bit of a journey, and your journey, Nate, is one that I've kind of followed from afar. And so it's nice to be able to connect and try to compare some notes and some things that are similar and some things that are a little different in terms of our stories. So,
all right. Love it.
Yeah. Could you paint for us a picture of what your upbringing looked like? Just give us some context on what it looked like to be Timm.
Yeah. With 2 M's. Well, my similarity to your story, Nate, is that my dad is a pastor, and so I grew up very much in the church. Church was, twice a day on Sunday and a couple times during the week, and so I really grew up with that context. Additionally, my dad was a chaplain in the army, essentially. So there was a lot of moving involved too. So in addition to being a family that had a lot of faith within it and a lot of structure, there was also a lot of change all the time. And growing up, to kind of kick things off, I would say I knew something was different about me, but I didn't recognize it first. What was really strange was having other people, particularly friends in school, who they noticed something different before I noticed something different, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
And that was a little disconcerting, right? Like, so you have people kind of identifying something is different about you. I can remember being called names. I can remember at one point that even escalating to some bullying and some physical kinds of confrontations. And, that was my first clue that something about me was tipping people off. Something was different. Something was not like everyone else. And it wasn't until later when words like gay were used. And at the time, I might have been like 3rd grade maybe at this time. And I didn't see anything in myself that I thought was that different from everyone else. I was like you, Nate. I wasn't very good at sports.
There's a reason.
Yeah, maybe that should have tipped me off. But I didn't even know at the time when kids were calling me these things. I didn't know what these things meant. And I lived in the religious upbringing that I had. I lived a pretty sheltered existence. And so sometimes having that understanding was not always there. So when I finally figured out what kids were honing in on, being a little bit more effeminate than the other boys, not being particularly athletic, also being kind of like close to the teacher and, those kinds of things, I learned that there were things about myself that were causing people to bully me. And I started very early trying to figure out how I could change and what I could do to make sure that kids, anyone around me, didn't see something different about me. And so that was really difficult, but in some ways it was also easy in the sense that because we moved a lot, I was given a chance every 3 or 4 years to change and to reset and to start with a new group of friends and to figure out, is there something that I can do in this round that I wasn't doing before, and will it help?
Wow. So
That's crazy.
You're basically making yourself a little bit straighter every 3 or 4 years with the new modifications of I move my hands weird. Cross that off. I say this thing. Dude, so similar. I can totally relate to that. That's wild.
Yeah. And I really tried. And I think the kind of frustrating or challenging part of it was that for the first move or two, when I was 5th grade, 6th grade, into middle school, which is a really tough time, kids would still pick, they would still see something different. And it wasn't until high school that I felt like I got to a point where I could really assimilate a little bit better. And in doing that, that became really, really intoxicating. When I finally got to the point where I could show up with a group of friends or in a peer set and not be called out as gay or words like sissy or anything like that, that was... It was almost like there was this little thing that went off in my head where I was like, I did it. I did something. I did something that was right. And that fueled for me the chance to feel like, okay, maybe I can get past this. Maybe this is something that's not going to define me, and maybe I can keep this part of myself on the shelf for as long as possible.
Did you know from an early age, because what you said there, that people were identifying things in you that were a little bit different? Could you also identify in yourself, I am a little bit different, and there might be something that sets me apart from my peers? And did that correlate to your sexuality, or was that just who you were, that you were finding was different? Yeah,
that's a great question. Shortly after this kind of experience started with other kids, I did know something was different. And, growing up in the church and being around, and I also grew up in the 80s, right? So I was a kid of the 80s, and my formative years were, in the height of that decade. And the church was a place that my family spent a lot of time. And so I learned also very early that being gay was also not safe. So I knew something was different. I didn't know that it was gay. I don't know that I would have called it that until I was a little bit older. And I started to have some attractions that I could kind of point to and say, oh, wow, there's something there. But even when I did, I started to hide as much as possible. And I did a really good job. I feel like in my own mind, I tried to disassociate a little bit. And it wasn't safe to be myself. My dad was a person who... I love him dearly, but at the time, things were said like those homosexuals, and, people who were gay were kind of considered these others. And I grew up with that. I grew up thinking that way. And so the idea that any part of me might in any way be similar or suggest that I might be queer in some way, that was just way too dangerous. So I wouldn't even allow myself to think about that, to be honest.
Yeah, dude, so similar. I can relate.
Yeah, it was, and to be honest, I think, looking back, I felt like I was doing all of the things that I should do to hide this part of myself, to not tip people off. The irony is, looking back at pictures of myself and videos of myself, and all of the things that exist, I see things in myself, almost as an outsider, where I could say, oh, wow, there were some definite reasons that I realized people kind of, pointed some fingers and questioned and were a little suspicious. My parents, to their credit, they never really said anything to me about it. And growing up, when I got to be in middle school and high school, I did what I felt was expected of me. I dated. I, went out with girls. We went to the movies. We did social things, and nothing about that felt off to me necessarily at the time. Looking back, I was really doing a lot of work to try to keep that going. The alternative for me, right, was just not possible. I felt as if my family would potentially reject me, particularly because of the religious upbringing that I had and the faith community that I lived in. And that was just way too scary. So I, learned to deal with that and tried to stuff it down, put it in a box, keep it on a shelf, not call it what it was. And then when I started to have attractions to other boys, middle school, high school, I would just shrug it off. I'd be like, well, that's not anything gay. That's just, me having a little bit of a fantasy. And I can still date a girl, and that seems like it's going well. So I don't want to pay attention to that. And I just kind of shrugged it off.
So you go through your childhood, middle school, high school, kind of repressing these feelings, and then you're dating someone, and eventually you get married to her. So could you walk us through that part of your life? Yeah.
So, how my story really kind of became complicated was getting married. In the 90s, I went to college in the 90s, started to really become my own person. And I graduated college in 1997. And I had met a really fantastic friend. She was my best friend, and I loved spending time with her. She was someone I couldn't get enough of in terms of being able to do things with, and we joked and we laughed and all of the things that I enjoyed. And because of the time frame that I was in, and because of that upbringing, layered on top of that things like the AIDS crisis, which was a really top of mind thing for me. It was just really, really top of mind. When I think about the fear that I had growing up about that crisis and the number of people that lost their lives, and I watched it very visibly, on television along with my family, and my family had very negative things to say about many of the people that were suffering from HIV and AIDS. And so, you layer that on top of everything. And I also didn't have any real role models. I didn't have connections with other gay people at all. I knew no one who was gay, at least no one who was out and proudly gay. And the few people that I did know weren't people that I looked at and thought, wow, they're really happy. And they're living great lives, and they're in a relationship, which is what I want. And they have kids, which is something I want. And all of those things started to weigh on me. And I just didn't see a path forward. I couldn't see any path forward where having a family, being in my own family as I was going to continue. And so when this opportunity developed with this friend, she was everything to me. And she turned to me one day and said, I'm waiting for you to tell me that you love me.
Whoa.
Yeah. It was a moment.
Wow.
In another world, that'd be like a romantic comedy, but not in this one. This is the dark one.
So when she said that to me, I thought, this is it. This is my moment. This is the reality of me becoming the family man and the good son and all of the things that I felt were expected of me. And I really did love her. I do still love her. And so I think everything just pointed in the direction of, you should get married. You should do this. This is the right thing to do. And so I did. I got married. And that was in 2001. We got married.
Oh, wow.
Shortly after college, yeah.
What's going through your head during that time of knowing that you have these attractions to men, and then you're getting married to someone that, like you said, like she's your best friend, you love her. So what's going through your mind during that?
Honestly, I was trying not to think a lot. I was trying not to allow the feelings that I was having deep down to surface in any way. And I'd spent a lot of time avoiding relationships with other guys in any fashion. No friendships, no connections, for fear that that might be too risky. It might develop into something that I didn't really want and I wasn't really ready for. And I didn't want to face myself at the time at all. And so throwing myself into my marriage was a really positive thing. And very quickly, from the moment that we got married, we also started having kids. I got married in March of 2001. December of that same year, we welcomed our first child.
Whoa.
And yeah, so, there was this very quick kind of pace. There was this kind of rush into, adulthood and family life. And I just threw myself into it. And I was working a lot at the time. And I was just consumed with so many things that there wasn't a lot of room for me to think. I will say that, even though I wasn't thinking so much, there were still things that were happening. There were still attractions that were happening that I tried to ignore. But, a coworker that would connect with me or, work closely with me, or a friend on the street that we lived on, which was full of young families. And I would find myself kind of having these moments of attraction and not really knowing what was happening and trying very quickly to say, okay, I'm not going to think about that. I'm going to just push that aside and we're just going to pretend that that's not there. And I'm going to continue to focus on all the other things that are going on in my life. And so I worked really hard to do that, but it was relatively easy at the time because just so much was happening. And it wasn't until years later that it just started to catch up with me.
Yeah, I mean, because during this time, and I want to keep it, PG, but you're not you feel fondness for your wife, but obviously there's something missing. And I think we're kind of told to not really address that, especially being pastors' kids. You're fully in all of the teachings. And I have other friends that are kind of in a similar situation. You're not really thinking about the fact that this isn't everything you want, but you're well, this is still something, this is still whatever. And, I've heard, I guess I'll let you talk, but I know you're probably wrestling with some of that piece. Yeah.
Yeah, quite a bit actually. And I would say that even though I was always attracted to my wife, I find her very attractive as a woman, but generally, the attraction was based out of my connection with her. It was really about this person that I felt really close with. So when it came to physical attraction, and it came to our connected lives around that, we worked pretty well through it. And I would say, I've talked with a lot of folks who have had this path, walked the path of getting married and then coming out later in life. And, to varying degrees, I've found men and women who have said it was easy for me or it wasn't so easy for me. I think for me, I was so deeply in it and I felt so, convicted that this was the right thing to do, the quote unquote right thing to do, that I didn't, try to allow the other thoughts to kind of creep in. But I'll tell you that even in those moments of being more passionate, I was still finding myself attracted to men. And that was alarming sometimes. It was whoa, this is not what I want. And at other times it was a great release. It was a chance to kind of escape, especially to kind of say, okay, there's this whole other part of myself that lives in this box. And every once in a while, if I'm feeling really stressed or I'm feeling really kind of broken or things are getting to me and I'm kind of strung out, I'll just kind of allow myself to think about those attractions a little bit. And it was a calming thing to a point. But yeah, we had some struggles, and I would say our relationship has always been more of a deep connection as friends than anything else. And that was what our relationship started as. We were 2 years, friends before we even decided to do any kind of dating. And that's not typical for a lot of couples. And so, I think that foundation for us, a lot of people I think would have looked at our relationship and said, wow, you guys look like you have such a great marriage and you're so connected and you really enjoy each other and you know each other and you laugh a lot with each other. And we had all of those things. But there absolutely was some stress. And I'll tell you that, for her experience, she would often say to me things like, what's going on? What are you thinking about? And I would pause and I would say to myself, I don't think it's safe for me to say this, what I might be really thinking. And so I didn't. Oftentimes I would come up with what I thought she would want me to say or what I thought she would want me, she would want to hear. And I did that almost knee-jerk. Like I just, was like, it's not safe. I can't say what's really on my mind. I can't say what I'm really thinking. Because if I do, this will take a horrible turn. And so I didn't. And she kind of knew it. I think there were many times that she understood. She knew me well enough. She knew me better than anyone. Even though she didn't know everything, she knew me better than anyone. And she knew that there were things that I was holding back, and she would kind of prod and kind of, try to get them out of me. But I just didn't feel safe. I didn't feel like it was something that I could share with her, even with her.
Wow. So it's interesting that you just painted that picture of there was... Oh, my bad. I'm actually just talking. I forgot about that we were recording. I'll walk it back.
No, you're good. That was funny.
So it's interesting that you painted this picture of yourself as like the person who's showing up in your marriage. And then there was another Timm behind the scenes that has all this going on. And so I'm curious, what happens? What's boiling up within you, that inner Timm, that you go, this is just too much. Like, I can't keep up this, what sounds like maybe a facade, because it wasn't a lie. Yeah. Your connection with your wife and that friendship was real. However, there were other things happening beneath the surface. So what's the tipping point there?
Yeah, great question. And you're absolutely right. It was... In my mind, anyway, it wasn't a lie. It was just this part of myself that I was holding back, that I didn't want anyone to see, including her. The bubbling up that you described is absolutely what happened. And over many years, very slowly, I started to get more and more weight that I felt on top of myself. And, growing up and even into my young adulthood, I was really anxious. I was always an anxious kid. I think I would have always been anxious even if I hadn't been queer, but the queer identity that I carried, I think, really exacerbated that anxiety. She would see me having panic attacks. She would understand that there was this kind of stress that I was feeling that looked very awful to her. And a lot of that, I think, was a byproduct of just trying to tamp all of this stuff down as best I could. So there just came a point around 2014. So it's been a while. It's almost 10 years now. It's the summer of 2014. And I just got to a point where I reached a nervous breakdown. And my body and my mind were just overwhelmed. And I can remember one morning waking up and feeling like, if I don't do something about this, I'm not going to survive. Like, this is just going to take me. And so she looked at me, and I was tears coming down my face. She said, what do we need to do? And I said, maybe we need to go somewhere. So we were literally on the way to a mental health hospital near where we live. And she was driving. She got me in the car. I was bawling my eyes out. And she just turned to me and said, in a moment, I think, of desperation, what is going on?
Dang.
What's happening with you? And I said, something just happened in my head at the moment. And I said, I'm attracted to men.
Dang.
And I didn't know what else to say. I didn't say gay when I first said it out loud. That seemed too scary to me, but it was the first time that I let a little bit of the water through the dam. And her first response was, oh shit, Timm.
Dang.
Wow.
And, because I don't think she didn't have any idea that was going to be the thing that was going to come out of my mouth. And, in doing that, that was the first step of many, many more steps. But it was scary. I will tell you that, like, the moment of saying the first words out loud to someone, particularly someone who I was so scared to hurt and so scared to let down and so scared to alienate, that was a really intense moment. But I just reached a point where it was either that or potentially something far worse in terms of my story. And I just couldn't do it. I said, I've just got to let this out. And so that was the first kind of chink in the armor of myself, kind of saying, okay, you've got to let this go.
Dang. So you basically held it all into the point of mental breakdown.
Yeah. And that mental breakdown, I mean, like, it was very real. And I will tell you, there was a week or two after that she and I struggled with, what does this mean? What should we do? And I think we were both kind of tentative, didn't know how to talk to one another, didn't know what to say first, didn't know really how much, I didn't know, for instance, how much to say and be really honest about. Because, again, I was so concerned about hurting her. And I've spent most of my life being a pretty good people pleaser.
Yeah.
You learn as a queer youth, you learn that, like, the thing that's going to protect you is to try to please other people with as many things as you can. You're a good student. You try to try to excel at things. You try to be creative. Anything you can do for that affirmation for people to say, you know what, you're great. Because there's this part of yourself that if you tell them, they might not react the way that you would want them to.
And being a pastor's kid too, like, you're also trained to be a good kid, and you're praised so much by everybody in the whole church for being, like, such a good kid, doing everything right. Like, that's aligned with my value is doing everything right. If I lose that, what else will I lose? You add that to being gay, and you're like, everybody is obsessed with you. And if you were to do this one thing, everybody would probably, like, be the exact opposite of that. So I know exactly what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I totally had that. At fellowship after church on Sunday morning, everybody walks up to you and thinks you're the, picture perfect family, and that you've got all of this going for you because you have God's blessings, and it's a wonderful thing. And beneath the surface are so many things that you're feeling that you just can't let out. And yeah, it was a very complex upbringing, trying to wrestle with that. And then also saying, okay, I do care about my family. I do care about these people in my life, and I don't want to hurt them or alienate them. But I also don't know what to do with this part of me.
Yeah. So what happens after you tell your wife, and it's basically now just open-ended? You
can't put that cat back in the bag.
I'm just so curious.
There was no putting the toothpaste back in the container, unfortunately. It was done. But I will tell you that, like, we struggled for a long time. And I think, for me, I didn't have enough confidence when I first came out. I didn't, that pressure cooker moment of releasing a little bit didn't really release all of it. But it released enough that I could kind of cope and get through the day-to-day stuff. But that went on for several more years.
Wait, real quick. Was that the first person that you ever told that you'd like, your wife was the very first person you'd ever told in your whole life?
That's
after
correct.
All this time, after you had a complete mental breakdown, was finally when you told one person that you liked men. That's crazy. Wow. Okay, carry on. Sorry, I just had to ask that.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, exactly. And I hadn't told anyone else. And for many years after that moment, that first kind of revelation with her, I didn't tell anyone else. It wasn't until 4 or 5 years later that I started to kind of boil again. The pot started to get a little bit big, or pressured. And I can remember saying to her at that point, was the first time that I used the word gay. For several years, we didn't touch it. We didn't talk a lot about it. My kids were still relatively young. I was very concerned about their upbringing, and, it just didn't seem like I could do much to kind of live into it. And I felt pretty strongly that I needed to focus on my family still. And so I did. Because she had asked me at that point when I came out to her at the first, kind of moment that she learned, she said, should I move out? Should you move out? Like, what should we do? And we kind of agreed that, no, we're going to keep going with this. This is going to be okay. We're going to work through this. But I will tell you, I don't think we really worked through much. I was in therapy at the time. I'm a lifelong therapy believer. And I did a lot to try to talk through that, and that helped to some degree, but I really wasn't dealing with a lot of the issues that I needed to deal with. And my kids didn't know either. My kids had no idea that this was going on. And at the time when I first told my wife, they were relatively young. My oldest would have been 12 years old or so. And so, even if I had the conversation, I'm not sure what I would have wanted to tell them. And just a lot of things were happening at that time. And so we went several years, and then finally I started to bubble again. And I said just very casually one day, because I'm gay. And she stopped me and she was like, wait, what? And I said, because I'm gay. And she said, what do you mean you're gay? And we had just had a huge, enormous breakdown in terms of our communication. Because when I said I was attracted to men, and when I, kind of shared all of my initial thoughts with her, she had made some assumptions, and so did I. And she was like, I didn't think you were gay. I thought you maybe were bi or, something else. And we just never really had those hard conversations. And so, to give you some perspective, that miscommunication meant that when I told her that I was gay, it kind of started the whole process all over. And at that point, I was ready to tell more people. I felt like, I had done a lot of research. I was looking at blogs, listening to podcasts, trying to get anything that I could get my hands on to say, is there anyone else out there like me? Because I didn't know. I didn't know if there were other married people that were going through this. I had no idea. And of course, you run to the Google machine and you type in all of these things and you say, okay, where can I find all this stuff? And I didn't find much, but what I found started to fuel my appetite for more. And then I realized very quickly that there are other people. And I started to reach out to support groups, and I started to connect with other people who were going through this same experience of being married and coming out later in life. And then things just started to bubble. And so I said to her one day, this was probably 2018, 2019, I said, I need to tell somebody else. I need people to start understanding this. And she, I think, was a little concerned at the time, but we went along and said, sure. And so I told my best friend, and I told both of my sisters over the course of the next several months. I have two younger sisters. That dipping my toe into the waters of telling more people and starting to come out, it was a little scary for sure. There were some people that responded very well, and there were a few that I sensed, and maybe this is just me reading into it, but I sensed there was some hesitation. I sensed there was some concern. I sensed there was some, what are you going to do with your marriage? What about your kids? What about all of these things? And those were certainly things I was thinking about. But at the time, I was just like, I need to let this out. I need to let more of the pressure and the steam out. So it was a slow process for me. I mean, I think, ultimately it culminated in 2021. So about 3 years ago, I turned to my wife and I said, I need to stop. And what I realized I needed to stop was trying to think about who knew and who didn't know. Because I still was editing myself. I was still like, okay, wait, in this situation, I kind of have to be careful about what I say and what I do. And in this situation, I don't have to worry as much. And it just became so much stress for me that I was like, I don't need everyone to know this about me. I didn't feel very strongly that it was critical that everyone know that I was gay. But for my own sanity, I needed people to know so that I could stop thinking about it. I could stop thinking about how to turn it off in situations where I felt like I still needed to turn it off. So I went to Facebook, as someone in Generation X does.
Oh no. Why? That's the worst one. That's the worst one. I could have told you that. It's scary. 2021 too. You're a brave man.
Yeah, it was right in the heart of the coming kind of slowly out of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And I will say that I wrote a very long and detailed kind of story, and I tried to give people perspective for those that were willing to read it, and explained why I was coming out. And at the time also explained that I hadn't figured out, what was next for me and for my family, but I just needed everyone to know. And that was really the watershed moment. That was the moment where everything in my life started to change finally. And, there were some people who struggled and didn't want to have conversations about it. And there were some people that came alongside me very quickly, and surprisingly in some cases, and said, we support you no matter what, and we love you. And, growing up gay and not really wanting to face it, you come up with all sorts of scenarios for what the worst case is going to be. You're prepared. Yeah. And at that point, I was prepared for my family to say, we can't accept you. I was prepared for other people in my life to say, we're going to need to walk away, because I was just so tired of everything.
I'm inspired by your authenticity. It's just, there's something admirable for me, just listening to your story. And I know you said it was a slow process to getting there, of fully, coming out and being authentic and truthful about who you are. However, I do know people who they have been met with this challenge, and coming into their marriage, they knew that something in themselves was a little bit different, that maybe wouldn't make this marriage work great. But instead of meeting it face on and, really sitting down with yourself and being honest, they've retreated and gone further down into denial. And so I'm curious how you show up now in your relationships as like full authentic Timm, like, here's who I am and I'm not scared of what you think. I'm not going to edit myself, like you said. What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, this was the discovery that I didn't expect. I knew coming out was going to be hard. I knew that saying the words to people in my life was going to be challenging, particularly with some people like my family. What I wasn't prepared for was how much work there was going to be after telling people, because saying I was gay was just the first step.
Right.
What I discovered was that the real work was about dismantling all of the mechanisms that I had put in place to protect myself. The honesty, which I struggled with. I constantly found that my knee-jerk response to folks was to lie, because it didn't feel safe to tell the truth. And so having to do things like build confidence around telling the truth, experiment with that, and also being able to look in my mirror and not just accept myself and say, okay, you're gay, but to say, it's good that you're gay, to affirm myself. That was really the real work. And no one had warned me about that. No one told me that that was going to be the thing that was going to be the harder piece of it. Because in retrospect, saying I was gay, that was challenging, but it was not the most difficult part of it. The most difficult part was to do that. And I'll tell you, even now, a couple years on, I still struggle. A lifetime of this compartmentalization, there's still some internalized homophobia. There are still days that I wake up and I question some things about my path and what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. And that's borne out by some programming that I've had for a long time. Yeah. And, I'm still susceptible to, online in certain areas. If I see something, particularly gay Christians, or those who kind of say, love the sinner, hate the sin, that really triggers me. And there's moments where I fall right back into being that 10-year-old kid and feeling like, whoa, maybe I shouldn't be doing any of this. And that's an honest thing that I didn't expect. And I didn't know that my life's work really is about letting go of the people pleasing, letting go of the need to meet people's expectations, letting go of this idea that choosing myself in some way is selfish. That is so hard. And I didn't know it was going to be this hard. So I'm still working through some of that. And I think what's been helpful is, building a support network of queer friends, and something I've never done in my life, obviously. I've always been at an arm's length from many people, particularly other men, and certainly other queer men. But now, working through that and spending more time with people and putting myself in spaces where there's an affirming, supportive environment, that is really something. And it's one of the reasons I started doing videos online. It's one of the reasons I started to try to reach out to other people. It was all born out of this idea that I needed this connection. I needed to kind of put myself in spaces where I wasn't just listening to my own voice, which wasn't so kind, but I was listening to other voices that were really affirming.
Yeah, I struggle with that so much. Like when you know that to survive, you have to hide parts of yourself, it's so hard to turn that behavior off, Like those are like your developmental years, right? So during those years, you're learning that you need to hide things. You can't be authentic. And like unlearning something you learned at like 7 years old, not easy. I'm still also dealing with that, honestly. So after you did the Facebook post, so you came out to the whole internet in the worst place possible. I did TikTok, which I found to be a lot friendlier, because like some of my friends saw it, but it was supposed to be like a quiet launch, because like I did on TikTok, I'm like, okay, maybe like 10-20,000 people will see this, and then of course like those first couple posts like got like 1 million. And I'm like, well, I guess this was not as soft of a launch as I thought it would be. But there were so many really positive people that like it really helped. It's like all these people are like, oh my gosh, go for it. That's so awesome. And then a few people are like, what the heck? And I got well, then obviously all my friends found out and I got text messages, the people I hadn't told yet. So there's other issues, but TikTok was a lot more encouraging. Sure. But after that all happened, what were the next steps with your family? Like, I've watched a few of your videos, but I haven't watched all of them. Like, what did you guys decide to do as a family? Like, did you decide to keep it together? Did you decide that like, I guess, what'd you do next?
Yeah, and I get these questions a lot because I share a lot of content around my story. And, I was definitely one of those people that saw yours right away and was really struck by how vulnerable you were, and also how seemingly comfortable and light you looked in terms of being able to share it. And I think that's what people respond to, right? Like you see someone who steps into themselves, whether it's, as a queer person or whether it's any other type of identity that people have, and it's intoxicating, right? Like you want to celebrate that with them. And I find that as I've shared more content online, I've gotten questions about like, well, what was your story? How, did this go? And certainly from a lot of married people, particularly married men who reach out and, are in some stage of this process. Some of them have not come out at all. Some of them swear they'll never say anything. And I was one of those people. I thought for sure, and when I got married, I knew there was this kind of thing, but I couldn't have imagined a scenario where I was going to say anything at any point in time. And so the idea that, I've pushed past that is still surprising sometimes to me. But, there's all sorts of stages that people are in, and they reach out with questions, and they reach out with, me too. And that's helpful for me as much as it is likely helpful for them. I often say to folks, I can't give you advice. I can't tell you what to do, because ultimately you have to find the path that's right for you. And I know lots of different paths that people have walked, particularly married people coming out. Some couples who have stayed together and tried to make things work. Some who have developed new types of relationships with one another. Some who very quickly divorce. There's all sorts of paths, and no one path is going to be the right path for everyone. So I often caution folks that, I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you what I've experienced and what I've learned. And I think that for my family, I'll start with my kids. Boy, was that the biggest surprise in this whole thing. I was deathly afraid of what they might say. These were people that I swore if any of my kids had told me that they couldn't accept this or that they weren't going to accept it, I'm not sure how successful I would have been moving forward, because I cared so much about what they thought. And I certainly was very cognizant of trying to make sure that their experience as young people growing into adults was going to be as positive as possible. But I also realized one day, I was like, well, if I can't be myself, how are they going to be themselves, right? Like, how am I'm not modeling any of the correct behavior here. And to be honest, I think I've always been a little distant from my kids.
Wow.
You know, I couldn't let them fully into who their dad was. And I think that kept our relationship from becoming as close as it potentially could have. And so I had a plan. I thought I was going to do this, you know, very kind of methodically. I talked with my wife about it and had a plan to kind of tell them, and it kind of fell apart one day with my daughter, my oldest. I have 3 kids, and at the time she was a senior in high school, 18 years old, and she just had a really rough day, and she walked away from the house to go hang out with a friend and spend the evening at a friend's house, not completely unusual. And 30 minutes later, I got a text from her, and something had tipped her off, and she said, Are you gay or something?
No way.
Oh, shoot.
I get this in a text, right? I'm looking at this text and I'm like, what is going on? We've said nothing to each other. And my first response was to panic. My second was to calmly kind of go, okay, I don't want to have this conversation with her over text. I want to have this face to face. So I texted her back and I said, you know, I'd be happy to talk to you about what's happening with me and, you know, pieces of my life, and but I'd love to do it, you know, with you in person. And the next text, like seconds later, was, well, if you are, it's okay.
Whoa.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that was a moment that I never anticipated, and it was one of the best gifts that I received in this whole experience, because not every parent who's in this situation has that experience. And, you know, before I knew it, we were texting back and forth for the next half hour or so, and she was asking questions like, well, what does this mean for you and mom? And, you know, what's going to happen next? And, you know, all things that I didn't quite at the time know the answer to. And before long, she said, well, I want you to be happy. And how about I help you and I help mom create some dating profiles, and we'll find good men for both of you.
Whoa. Wow.
That's
not
so
expecting
funny.
that, I bet.
Oh,
Dang.
Not expecting that at all. That was not the next thing that I expected. And, you know, I think that goes to show, like, just how differently my kids grew up. You know, my son at the time that I was having this text message back and forth with his older sister, my oldest son was on the sofa, and I was like, okay, well, if she knows, I got to tell the other kids. I can't, you know, keep secrets here. And I was trying at the time to work on honesty. And so I had him take off his headphones. He was wearing headphones, as young people do. And I said, hey, I need to tell you something. And he said, okay. And I said, you know, it's been a little stressful around the house. Your mom and I have been kind of like struggling. Like, there's a reason for that. And it's because I'm gay. And his eyes got really big and wide. And he said, really? I said, yeah. And he said, good for you, Timmy. You go.
Timmy. That's awesome.
Yeah,
Does he always call you Timmy, or is that like a special?
They sometimes, my kids sometimes call me Timmy. It's like a family thing. A whole bunch of folks call me that. And so, he was really celebratory about it, and then turned to me, and my wife at the time was sitting on the sofa, and said, so are we going to have a coming out party for Dad? And I mean, just the kids really have responded so well. My immediate family, my nuclear family, so my sisters and my parents, you know, I took some time before I told them, and I was thoughtful about that as well. I woke up on my 45th birthday 2 or 3 years ago, and I just said, today's going to be the day. Today's going to be the day. And I called both my mom and my dad separately, and I told them. And I was most concerned about my father. as a minister, as someone who had a long history of having some very vocal thoughts about LGBTQ people, I was bracing myself, and I had reached a point where I was ready for our relationship to be severed if it had to be. I wasn't my 10-year-old or 18-year-old self concerned about being thrown out of the house. I was a 45-year-old man, and I was like, okay, if this is gonna go south, okay. He said some things that I expected, and he said some things that I didn't. The one thing that he said that I expected was, "I'll pray for you," which had the undercurrent of like, I'll hope and pray that this is going to be something that you deal with in a way that, you know, your church family would be most proud, and that God himself would be most proud. And there was just an undercurrent of that. But to his credit, you know, in the same breath, he also said, this doesn't change how I feel about you, and I love you. And I understand that this isn't something that you're going to be able to change about yourself. And so just know that I deeply care and love you. And that was, again, something I didn't really expect. I was really bracing myself for the worst. So we've had multiple conversations, he and I, since then. And he, every once in a while, digs into the scriptures and presses on some things. And, he can't remove his theology any more than I can remove my queerness. And sometimes that's a challenge, but I've gotten to a good point with my family. And I think that, while I don't think that they affirm everything that I have done or that I have chosen to do, I think that I do feel that they've supported it to the degree that they can. And I think that says a lot about them. And I'm grateful for that. I certainly am grateful for that. So,
could you speak to what your relationship looks like now with your wife? It sounded like you guys were best friends, and then this is something that you're going through, obviously, that's impacting you internally, externally, and it's also impacting her. And so I imagine there are now, in the culture that we live in, sexuality, we're just so much more open to talking about it, and so there are a lot more later in life gay Christians coming out, and obviously it impacts not only the kids, and your kids sound freaking awesome, by the way. Sounds like you guys did a great job with them, but it also impacts that partner, your wife in this case. So could you speak into to that part of that dynamic?
Yeah, and you're going to hear some heaviness in my voice, because oftentimes the content that I've been sharing online recently has been rooted in the challenges that still exist for my wife and I. So I'm still technically married. We have not divorced, but we have been separated for a number of years, and we have continued to try to stay in each other's lives and support each other as best we can. I'll say that I think there's still some struggle there for both of us. Neither of us wants to see the end of that relationship. And I think that my wife also grew up a devout Catholic in a home that was, very religious, although I would say that she was probably not as influenced as much as I was by the environment. And she struggles with her own faith and what she believes. But I think that one thing she does believe strongly in is family and the sanctity of marriage. And so that has created some challenges for her and for us. I have tried over the last several years in this whole process to give her the grace of understanding that I lived with this for decades, right? Like, this was in my head, and I struggled with it for a long time. And she didn't get as much time to kind of marinate with it. So I've really tried to give her some space to do that, to kind of come to terms with what she needs to come to terms with. But I'll tell you, I think she struggles with this idea of me as a different person, as a queer person. And what I've tried to suggest is, I'm still the same person. I'm still the same cake. There's just a layer that you didn't know was there. And I think that took some time for her to really, embrace and to understand. And oftentimes she'll say things to me like, I don't understand. And I'll say, well, you don't need to understand. You just need to accept that this is what it is. And that's a hard thing still, I think, for some people, especially when, her life is impacted by this as much as mine. And so I'm trying to be sensitive to that. And we're trying to find a path forward that allows for our family to be as close and connected as possible, but at the same time allows me to move forward in terms of being the fully gay out person that I am. And, coming out midlife, coming out at any point in your life, really. I mean, I think this is true for anyone, no matter what your age. You kind of go through this adolescence, like a new adolescence of sorts, where you're like, wait a minute, I'm finally free to feel what I feel in a way that I've never been able to before. I sometimes joke that I feel like a 14-year-old, I feel like a stunted teenager, and you have these moments where you pinch yourself and you're like, wait, am I really doing this? Am I like, gonna walk in a gay pride parade? Am I gonna, tell people that I work with that I'm queer? Like, there's so many things that I couldn't have anticipated in this scenario, and I've got a lot more work to do. I mean, there's no doubt that this is not over yet by any stretch of the imagination. But, that path of discovery is still there for my wife and I. And, I've thought to myself, this is the one and only woman that I will ever marry. Right.
Wow.
And for her, I've tried to reinforce that puts her above a lot of people in my life. And that we will be connected in ways that no two people are for the rest of our lives, no matter what happens. And I think I'm self-aware enough, to know that I've made some challenging mistakes in this process. I mentioned this has been a slow journey, like a really slow journey at times. But I will say that I think I don't have many regrets. I feel that the time it took for me to get to where I was ready to say what I needed to say and do what I needed to do, I mean, that was purposeful time. And, even looking forward, the time that it will take me to take the next steps that I potentially am going to take, there's a need for that time. And I would, say to anyone, there's no one speed that you need to go, right? And everybody's going to have their own, and some people are going to make changes and do things really fast, and others are going to take their time and have different things that they need to work through. For me, sometimes it's just getting out of my own way, right?
Yeah.
And I've still got that vestige. We talked about this a little bit, but I've still got those vestiges of homophobia, and I don't know, and maybe this thing that I want to do isn't the right thing, and struggling with that just has shown me that I've got some work still to do in terms of stepping into myself more fully and doing that. And a therapist who I had been working with for a long time, really great guy, said, listen, your mind's not coming along, right? Like, you're not going to be able to force yourself to think about this differently. Maybe the better way to approach this is to start changing how you behave, start living as a gay person, and then let your mind come along for the ride. Like, don't necessarily try to think your way out of this, which as an overthinker, I try to do all the time.
Yeah. It's being an overthinker and a gay pastor's kid is a really, really fun time.
It's a wicked combo.
Yeah. Trying to figure this one out up there is mind-numbing. And it's so much to sort through that, I also just put it all back there. It's funny, you were put in so many impossible situations, and I feel like I can relate. You're in between everything. Your parents are, expecting this life for you, so you don't even consider being gay. And then when you finally let yourself consider being gay, you have already been in a marriage for this many years. You have kids. You've got all these things, but it seems like you've really walked through it with grace. And even now, navigating this with grace, navigating this conversation with grace. I feel like you're talking about it while really honoring the people around you, and I really respect that. And I think even right now, you're still soft and kind, and doing the best you can to take care of your family, which I think speaks loads to your character and your heart, because you went through hell in a lot of ways, but you push through it, and stayed soft. So I really respect that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think I never really had thought about my situation in any way as traumatic, right? Like I never thought growing up, I wouldn't have described my upbringing as trauma in any way. I think looking back, I subjected myself for a lot of reasons, right? I subjected myself to some things that were, in fact, pretty traumatic. And that trauma is still with me. And what I've tried to acknowledge and realize, and I think, for other folks who are in this situation, whether you're 20, whether you're 30, whether you're, in some cases, 50, 60, 70, because I know men who are going through this exact situation, having been married for 35 or 40 years and have grandchildren. We just grew up in a very different time, and thankfully things have evolved in many ways. There's still a lot that needs to change and still needs to kind of advance. And recently I'm deeply troubled by some of the things that have happened around LGBTQ people, particularly trans people. But there's been such an advance. I mean, I never thought in a million years, when I got married in 2001, I never thought gay marriage would be a thing in our culture. I never thought that there'd be such family units, and if that had been a path for me, if that had been presented to me, I might have made different choices, but I will tell you this: I don't regret the choices that I made. I'm grateful for my family, so very grateful to be a father, grateful to have the kids that I have, and they are such wonderful people in and of themselves, and those are gifts that I would not want to trade in. And so sometimes I do struggle. There's folks outside of this experience who are very quick to say, "Oh, you're just breaking up your family and you're being selfish," and that's certainly their prerogative to think that. For me, it's less about the idea of being selfish and more about just honoring that there's this part of myself that I needed to honor years ago. And that was the mistake that I made. The mistake that I made was not getting married. The mistake that I made was not coming out. The mistake that I made was not being honest in the first place. Because if I had been, then a whole bunch of people could have made different decisions potentially. And I recognize that rests with me. But I don't think there's a point where it's too late, to be honest.
That's so good.
That's really good.
Drop that mic, because wow. That was awesome. Yeah, that was good. Well said. Yeah. Well, Timm, could you tell our listeners where they can find you, connect with you, all the things?
Yeah. So I have a couple places on social. Like Nate, I dabble in, when I have time, in TikTok, so you can find me there. My handle there is Timm with 2 M's, Baldwin, and you'll notice that it's me because my username is Timm with 2 M's. And you can also find me on Instagram under Coming Out Later, which really just defines this late bloom that I have had as a person who's in my 40s and navigating a lot of this stuff. So, and I'm always eager and happy to connect with people. I find that happens several times a week. And the stories, in connection with other people that are going through this, whether they're married or not, they've been really good for me, because I find that, first of all, I'm humbled if anyone finds any value in my own story. That's deeply humbling to me. And Nate, your story absolutely resonated with me. And so I'm touched when that happens for anybody, but I'm actually really influenced by other people's stories. And I can't get enough, honestly. I still kind of crave podcasts and blogs and any kind of content I can get my hands on, because I think I'm still learning and I want to learn more about myself. I think one of the deepest and most challenging things about this process for anybody who comes out is trying to separate what you who you are that was there to meet someone's expectations and who you are as your real self. And that is a work in progress for me. You know, there's still parts of myself that I'm like, wait, did I do that? Or was I like that? Or am I like that because I think that's what other people want me to be? Or is that who I really am? And some of that is what I'm doing at this point in my life as a 14-year-old, sorting through all of that and trying to kind of like say, okay, like what's Timm and what's actually not? What was kind of there for someone else's benefit as opposed to my own? And that, it's exciting work. It's also difficult work at times, but that in doing that with other people, when people are willing to connect, I find it's really meaningful for me as much as it is for them.
Yeah. No, just like this conversation was meaningful. I feel like it was really cool hearing your story, and thanks for sharing and being so open. I know there's a lot of personal stuff we're talking about, and it's really, really beautiful to see someone who's, journeyed this really well. And it's still journeying. I think like people will probably be following you, and again, that's coming out later on Instagram. We'll be following and seeing, where your journey takes you next. I know I'll be, and we're friends on there. So yeah, thanks again for being on here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Seriously, you showed up so vulnerably and willing to dive in with us, and really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Susie and Nate. It's been great to connect with you, and thanks again for the opportunity.
Absolutely. We'll keep in touch. Well, guys, that was another awesome episode, and
that was so good.
It was so good.
Oh my gosh.
I think we're getting a good variety of stories. Yeah. We're having some fun.
How are we going to be honest this week?
How are we going to be honest this week?
I feel like there's like another level of honesty. That
listen, if you come up with good ways to do it, I'll take any cheat sheets that you have.
Yeah.
Because I struggle.
There you go.
The struggle bus is real.
It is real.
It is real. Well, think about that. Think about that, listeners, when you go home today. How can you be more honest?
Maybe they are home.
Maybe you're honest already. Maybe you weren't closeted and you got to be honest the whole time. That was probably great for you.
I think we all could step into more honesty. Anyways, okay.
Yeah, you
bye,
could be
guys.
more honest.